I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider the news of the day. Now let's begin with an update on the baby from Tuaran, Sabah, who was infected with the polio virus, making it the first case in 27 years after Malaysia was declared free of the disease. Now the baby boy is in stable condition at the moment, although he is still on respiratory aid and is now being held in an isolation room. So the Sabah Health and People's Wellbeing Minister, Poon Ming Fung, said that there are no new cases of polio that have been reported in Sabah so far. However, according to Jennifer Lasimbang, who is Sabah's Assistant Education Minister, the current polio problem could have been averted if the Federal Health Ministry had heeded warnings 5 years ago by UNICEF.
Right, so Melissa, we have this situation, and it's often the case where we learn in retrospect, if that's even a possibility, about how systems fail, how politicians do not respond, or in many cases, how the public itself is engaging in some sort of self-harm. And I think one of the first memes that came out of this news breaking was that this was the triumph of the anti-vaxxers. Now, it's not clear to me, and from the analysis, whether the anti-vaxxers were really at fault in this case.
Right, I agree.
Could be something else, but as we see in the case of Samoa with the outbreak of measles there, what the anti-vaxxers do is that they prevent remedial action being taken. So in Samoa, the government has actually arrested anti-vaxxers because some of the leading advocates, for the conspiracy theories that they have, suggested that immunization would be harmful, and so preventing public health officials from carrying out their duties in an efficient way. So very interesting, maybe convergence of different dynamics,
sure.
Systems failure, anti-vaxxer conspiracy theories, perhaps a lack of legislation that forces or makes compulsory immunization.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. The conversation that has come out, because of the anti-vaxxers from this polio case has been interesting. I think it's brought to the forefront the discussion about the importance of vaccination. However, I think with the case in Sabah, looking at the warnings of UNICEF from 5 years ago, UNICEF tried to convince the health ministry to vaccinate the undocumented population in the state, but it had failed. So I think in this case, Sabah's big population of people who are undocumented, unregistered, without identification papers, it makes it impossible for them to get vaccinated. Not impossible, but extremely expensive. Apparently, some 40 ringgit, I think, for to get vaccinated for registration, and an additional 40 ringgit for one vaccine.
Okay, so this is back to this other discourse that happens, and this is a kind of narrowly cast nationalist rhetoric that often says, oh, we only need to protect our own. When it comes to disease, of course, there are no boundaries. Disease does not recognize citizenship and non-citizenship. We see that in the case of tuberculosis, has infected our prison system, affecting local staff.
Right.
So again, if you take the attitude that because people are foreigners or undocumented or are non-citizens, they are not deserving of basic humanitarian care, it comes back to haunt us.
Yes.
And it comes back to haunt us in very material ways.
Exactly. So now the cost to this is that the health ministry will vaccinate all foreigners in Sabah. Children under 5 years old will now get an additional polio vaccination. So again, an additional cost. There's a risk to the wider population, the problem that could have been averted before it got to this stage.
Right, so costs there, again, needs to be understood in terms of the long-term effects, the externalities. If you just measure costs in terms of what actually you're paying out and not recognize the cost that comes from actually not doing those actions, then you have a really bad system of accounting, I think.
All right, in other news, we have the United Nations Development Programme having a dialogue today on the Human Development Report 2019 and Malaysia's performance. So the Human Development Index measures 3 basic dimensions of human development. The first, life expectancy. The second, access to knowledge. And the third, standard of living. And that's measured by the gross national income, or GNI. So Malaysia's Human Development Index value for 2018 is 0.81, which puts us in the very high human development category. Now, this was mainly boosted because we had a 168% increase in our GNI in the past 3 decades. But to be honest, Sharaad, I think we really need to be thinking about inequalities in human development beyond the dollars and cents, beyond the disparities when it comes to income and wealth.
Yeah. So you have, I guess, governments need measures, and they need fairly standard measures. And behind that, of course, is the ability for governments to get the data necessary to plot where the country is in terms of, but then again, you need also data that's much more granular, that goes to specific regions. And I think beyond the numbers, Melissa, there's really, I think, a pitch for all kinds of contributions to the question of inequality that could come from anthropologists, that could come from journalists, come from a whole range of people looking at the experience of inequality, because the implications are not just in terms of wages and assets that you might hold, and such, but it has to do with your life experience and the kind of person you become.
And the deprivations that you experience within that life cycle, deprivations to access into healthcare, into access into education. And I think addressing poverty beyond a monetary measure is important. Right now, one of the ways to do this is through the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or the MPI, which measures poverty and well-being, considering a range of deprivations that individuals experience.
Melissa, isn't there a data issue when it comes to Malaysia?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think, you know, as always, good policies require good data. And one of the reasons why the MPI, the Multidimensional Poverty Index, was calculated for 101 developing countries in the Human Development Report, Malaysia was not part of this because we lacked the relevant data.
Right, okay, so if we lack the relevant data, I imagine it cannot be because we're not collecting it, or we do not have the expertise to collect it. We clearly have lots of universities and smart people, people smart enough to collect data. Then the question is, what's happening? Is it because data in this country, especially held by the state, is considered secret or sensitive, and therefore they're not sharing the data that's there, or is it, as I suggested, maybe we're just not collecting it?
You know, I found, one of the things that I found within the dialogue at UNDP was that many countries around the world have addressed this problem. I mean, data is sensitive. Statistical data, disaggregated statistical data is sensitive in every country. But the fear, has been largely overcome in many countries, but Malaysia has yet to deal with what data could mean. No country wants to admit that, that inequality happens, but the truth is inequality happens everywhere. So having data just means that we are able to have evidence-based policy response. All right, quickly in other news, we have some tragic news. A young elephant was found dead near Kampung Orang Asli Sedoho in Kluang, Johor recently, believed to have been poisoned based on the evidence found at the location. Yeah,
so, in fact, the assembly person for Kahang came out to say that it was tragic, the culprits needed to be, apprehended. But he did also go on to say, we need to find a solution to human-animal conflict, or human-elephant conflict in this case. And perhaps the solution, he says, is to put them in sanctuaries. Now, I've been following the story of elephant and megafauna in this country for just about half a year now.
It's not the first time this has happened,
No, it's
right?
not the first time. We had these tragic cases of pygmy elephants in Borneo being murdered as well, but therefore perhaps their tusks. Here we have a different situation. The question is, are our solutions right? Is the sanctuary, which sounds like a happy kind of large zoo for the elephant, really the way to go? I hear experts are saying it's not. We need to have a conversation about this. All
right. Well, we'll continue having that conversation on Consider This. But immediately after the break, we're going to take a closer look at the legal implications of that statutory declaration from Azila Hadri. So make sure you stay tuned to Consider This. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you. Now, 5 years after the federal court found him guilty for murder, former Commando Azila Hadri has now laid the blame for the 2006 killing of Altan Tuya Sharibu at the feet of Datuk Sri Najib Razak. Now, this is stated in his statutory declaration dated 17th October 2019. So today, the federal court has fixed April 20th, 2020 for the hearing of Azila's application for a review of his conviction and death sentence over Altan Tuya's murder. To help us unpack the legal implications of this, we have joining us on the line Ariq Zakri, practicing lawyer and former Deputy Public Prosecutor. Ariq, thank you for joining us on the line now. Can you help us understand the legal implications of Azila's statutory declaration?
A statutory declaration is, under law, basically a statement made out of court by a person to a person who can receive this statement, a commissioner for oaths. And whatever he says, this can be receivable in court. So the implication is that basically he runs the risk of perjuring himself. That really is the ultimate risk for himself. And he is taking this risk by coming up with this new series of allegations. That's the implication on him. Right. The implication on the process, as is that, well, I'm not saying it's a risk, but yeah, it is a risk, isn't it? That,
okay, Ariq, can we go back to the question of perjury here? You're saying he runs the risk of perjuring himself because he did not mention this as a material fact in the case. In a case that is well known for the fact that the men who confessed to the murders didn't in fact have, or seemingly have, a motive.
Yes, as found by the trial judge, motive is not essential to proving the murder case. However, I think a lot of us were thinking, you know, why would police officers want to take the deceased to the forest and take her down, somebody who they don't even know? There must have been some kind of motive. So, yeah, his SP conveniently supplies his motive as that of basically being superior orders. That's what it is.
Now, sorry, go ahead, Sharaad.
Well, so the question is, now that he has a review, now the fact is, even if it turns out that the court recognizes that this is new material evidence, does it in any way affect the sentence? Because he is not saying that he did not murder her, and that still stands, right? Because he did in fact murder her, doesn't his death sentence stand? Does it change that material fact?
Okay, you're asking more than one thing. Can I try to go one by one?
Sure.
Okay, firstly, we have this principle of the integrity of the judicial process, and secondly, we have this finality of judgment. So after you have lost the case, all the way to the federal court, it's not that easy for you to just come up with something new. You pull something out of a rabbit's hat, and you say that everything I said over the last few years, and all the statements that I've made, all the positions I made, were all phony. But you come up with something new. It's not really that easy. We have this finality of the judgment. And a judgment can only be set aside. Very, very difficult. It has to have been, as I understand it, to have been procured by fraud. It's one of the ideas. But after having undergone the entire process, it's very, very blue moon. You know, it's very uncommon.
Okay.
So how does it affect his process, his sentence? Even if he had introduced this defense of superior orders earlier on, hypothetically, I don't think it's necessarily something that easy for him.
Can I just clarify one thing? So earlier you said that Azila runs the risk of perjuring himself, yes? Would that in any way jeopardize future testimony from him?
In my opinion, it would go to the weightage as to how his future testimonies may be considered in any hypothetical cases or scenarios. Because the fact is, he's given conflicting evidences on oath in the past. So that is under our civil law system. If we look at, for example, Islamic fiqh, it will be rejected outright. I mean, some school of thought. You've lied once, your testimony is rejected from then on. In our civil law system, I really don't know how this has panned out. I've not handled this kind of case before.
Right. So then what do you make of the federal court's decision, Aziq, to hear Azila's application for the review of his conviction and his death sentence next year?
To me, I don't think really there's really much to be excited about. I mean, I think it's an administrative thing that they want to fix dates, just like dates are fixed by the federal court and court of appeal, you know, all the time. It doesn't mean that there's any merits to his application. You know, and let's see how they handle this.
I think there's this other thing, because there's been a lot of criticism in the past about the particular trial, the trial that led to the conviction of those two men and their sentencing. What do you make of that? Because there seems to be a political context in which the trial, proceeded, and also, of course, implications for the integrity of the judiciary, for both the prosecution as well as the defense.
You got to say that right, Sharaad. You got to say that right. The prosecutor.
Yes. So the question is, if there was a criticism, I mean, do you think that changes anything? We've had a change of government. The person who is considered to be the mastermind, or alleged to be the mastermind, it was in power, no longer is in power. Are these material facts for the courts to take into consideration?
My only concern as just an observer is why Razak Baginda's appeal did not proceed. That's the only bit. As for the way the rest of the trial went, again, as just an observer and somebody who read the judgment, just as a bystander, I mean, they've had all avenues open to them. They had very able counsel, several counsel at several stages. They had 2 tiers of appeal. I can't really remark outwardly anything substantively outwardly wrong for them. I just wonder why they didn't proceed with Razak Baginda's appeal.
All right, as an outside observer, what was your initial reaction when news of this statutory declaration broke? I mean, I'm just wondering whether the timing of it is at all relevant.
I don't know. I have no idea. I mean, you have SDs coming out here and there. You have from this Router guy out of left field. You know, God knows what other SDs coming out tomorrow. So there's just such a saturation of political outlandishism. We feel tired and fatigued, you know.
All right, well, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight, Azik.
And get some rest.
We'll be back with more on Consider This in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Now, here's what we want you to consider tonight. So the Youth and Sports Minister, Syed Saddiq, has called for a policy that guarantees youth appointments for top posts in GLCs. Now, this is him suggesting a quota similar to that reserved for women. He wants more youth inclusion in decision-making at the governmental level because he says there is a notable absence of youths holding senior positions in GLCs. Sharaad, what do you make of this?
Well, okay, let's put it this way, Melissa. I think Syed Saddiq's concerns start with attacking the premise that young people are not ready to make decisions, and then, you know, they're not mature enough, and so on and so forth. And I think on that score, I would give it to him. That, in fact, young people, as much as older people, can make good or bad decisions about policy and so on and so forth. The question is, why GLCs and why a quota? And whether we open up the possibility for, again, the giving of, gifts to people associated with us and so on and so on. So it's not so much having a quota, who's going to fill that quota is something that I would be very concerned about.
So quotas are, I guess I would say, sometimes necessary to ensure equal access to opportunities, right? And I would say if he wanted to make a comparison with a quota for women, the 30% quota for board members and women, then you would have to first ask the question, women in Malaysia are undeniably a marginalized majority. We know that. There are research and studies that have shown about the gender gap within the workplace. However, can we say the same about youths? Are youths a marginalized majority? Could you answer that question?
Well, you know, look, I'm not entirely sure if youth are a category, but often when it comes to GLCs and any corporate entity, the question of whether you have the requisite experience, if you have some contribution to the conversation that's necessary to drive this growth strategy or any other strategy within that entity, I think is what is crucial. So the idea of pushing youth there because the principle that diversity at a board level is actually good for an organization.
It
Is there well established as a principle, as a, you know, as kind of taken for granted kind of idea today in the 21st century. The issue is that why just youth? Why just women? If you're going to take the diversity principle forward, there are many things and many communities that are in fact marginalized and excluded. So let's talk about people from Sabah and Sarawak. Are they on GLCs and represented sufficiently? What about all the non-Malay, non-Bumiputra, non-Muslim individuals within GLCs? Are they adequately represented?
Right.
So why stop the diversity principle at youth?
Okay.
And again, who's going to be this youth-led delegation? Who's going to make the decisions? Is it going to be the minister himself?
No, well, I think that's up to the boards, right? So having a quota for GLC, and I'm just paraphrasing from what I've read in the news, that this proposal or this, you know, the suggestion to have youths as part of, you know, decision-making positions in GLCs, I wonder where he's coming from, and I'm trying to think about, you know, the argument here. Many boards of directors are of a certain generation, and businesses nowadays have to deal with disruption and change very quickly, and I'm wondering perhaps having a youth perspective on the board may be a good thing. Now I'm going to put this to you. There are younger CEOs. I mean, if you look at big tech in America, the average age of a CEO of big tech is 47 years old. Now that's young, that's dynamic, and the board should be reflecting the same dynamics of a company.
Well, okay, and maybe GLCs suffer from the idea that many of the people on the board are there because it's a sinecure, it's a reward for loyalty to the government of the day, or et cetera, right? So the question is, how do you make those boards actually work for the public good? Now, like women, the youth category isn't undifferentiated. We're people who are young, who have different value systems, different ideologies, different outlooks on life, different takes on the question of the gig economy, all these things that you're talking about, right. You know, the great disruptors in the business world today. So it isn't simply a question of getting somebody who, you know, who is younger than 45 or younger than 35. I don't know what the category is now for youth. But the point would be, what exactly is the substance of that youth in that position? And I worry that, again, we go back to quotas to drive any kind of discussion, and quotas often mean somebody is in the role of making those decisions, and they're going to get political rewards for doing so.
Well, okay, quotas are only problematic if the implementation is superficial, if it's self-serving, if it allows for the breeding of nepotism and cronyism, and that's where I think the issue we have with quotas. But quotas, as a temporary measure to correct an imbalance in opportunity, I think is necessary, especially if you want to make sure that the playing field is level for those who have been historically marginalized.
Right. So let's take the example of women, and I think in the case of women, quotas really do help, because the male privilege is a real hard nut to crack. And I say that as an older male, you know, but because from a marginal community, that older men don't want to give up their privilege, right? So to crack that nut, especially because women represent a half of the population.
Yes.
And it wouldn't be the same if you're talking about ethnic quotas, if you're talking about regional quotas. Much harder to kind of decipher how that would work out, right? But the important thing is women, because they're half the population, you don't have to talk about a dearth of talent and so on and so on. Women are perhaps more talented than men. So the issue really is with the youth quota, what is it that we're talking about? What is this youth that Syed Saddiq wants to promote?
Can I just say, I think it's, I'm speculating here, but I think it's the perspective of the youth, perhaps a change in the way we've done things for so long.
Well, but is there one perspective? I mean, you can count any number of young people who do not think like Syed Saddiq, right? And who don't have the same approach to social media or to politics.
Agreed.
Or his ideas about the economy. there are different types of young people. So I'm not sure who these young people that he wants to promote or see there in GLCs. Maybe if he could be more precise about their outlook and their values. Youth itself isn't a descriptor for values.
Well,
it's purely a placeholder. It's a large category.
It's not a monolithic block, right? And I don't think he speaks for all youth, if I may say. Well, we'll have to wait to hear from the Minister for more clarification on this suggestion. But for tonight, that's all we have for Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me, Sharaad Kita. We'll be back with you same time tomorrow for another episode. Thank you so much for watching and good night.